Hi guys, what is going on, and welcome back to another video on Conqueror's Blade. So we actually did a tier list video probably almost a year ago or so now, and I thought it was time to have a little bit of a revisit because, well, a lot has changed on the meta. We've also had the introduction of the Pike as a new hero weapon since I last did this, and there's been a lot of buffs and a lot of nerfs which have kind of changed this around quite a lot, so I think it's well worth a revisit. I guess just before we get into the full video though, we should have a few caveats, because I need an excuse to get out of this if you all disagree with me. This is random sieges, not territory wars. I don't really play territory wars anymore. Been playing this game for over 3 years. Used to play territory wars, but don't anymore. So this is random sieges, not territory wars, and that does shift things around a little bit. On top of that, obviously we're not all going to agree. You're going to like some classes more than me, you're probably going to like some classes less than me, but hopefully some at least we'll agree on. And finally, this is kind of a class average. You, for example, might be an amazing longsword player, and you might be able to get the class to perform really, really well for you, but you might be an outlier. If the average performance of most longsword users I encounter is somewhere in the medium, just because you're really good doesn't mean that the class in itself is really good. It means because on average, most people play it in that way. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. At least that's how I'm trying to approach it, in sort of a vaguely statistical way, even though we have no actual statistics, unfortunately, which would be lovely to get. My games are booming. Please give us more statistics on this stuff. It would be really, really interesting. But anyway, let's kick things off. Let's start, I think, probably going just on the S tier, because these are going to probably be the two most interesting ones. And I think really it's going to have to be Maul, and it's going to have to be Pike. Now let's break this down as to kind of why I think this. Maul first. Obviously it's the classic example. Been in the game since Season 3. Really strong hero has always been, and it's had a few changes and alterations, but actually hasn't radically changed from its original release setup. Now, its raw damage is really high, and that's probably for me what puts it into S tier. But I think it's only just. I think the meta has changed slightly in heroes to much more CC control. And the Maul really lacks that. It doesn't really have much CC, particularly when you compare it to something like Poleaxe. You know, a short sword, some of the ranged classes with their CC abilities, Glaive, dual blades, these sort of things have quite a strong or quite a large amount of CC options available to them. And the Maul really only has sort of one CC recovery ability. That then kind of leads us on to the ultimate, the grab. I think it's bad design. I've never really liked it. I just don't think it leads to a fun experience for bulk of the player base. But I'm not convinced it's actually all that overpowered. I think actually for the Maul, the true power of the Maul is actually in its raw damage and the fact it hits through block with blunt. That's powerful. I don't think the grab actually is. It's just annoying. So yeah, for me, it's S tier, but just. I think it could almost sit in A at the moment. I think it has shifted around, but we'll leave it in S for now. Then we move on to Pike. Now, in many ways, I'm almost immediately going against my own rule that I talked about average play of a class, because I think Pike is one that when you get good at it, that's when it really shines. I think there's definitely going to be players out there, perhaps newer players or people who haven't played the game so long who, you know, hearing that the Pike is very powerful, go and grab the Pike and just think, you know, what the hell is this class about? It doesn't do anything. I can't escape. It has very little damage. Why is this considered a powerful class? But it's when you get good at it and when you can start to use the abilities in conjunction, you can basically endlessly stun people, put out huge amounts of damage with an ultimate that fires through units, causing not only damage to the unit but to the hero on the other side. It has an amazing amount of escape abilities. The mobility is just insanity, which basically makes this class that is high damage, very, very mobile, with a large amount of stun and CC options that can deal with pretty much anything that it faces, and it's very hard to catch and kill. And so for me, that makes the Pike really probably the most powerful class in the game at the moment, or certainly the class with the most potential to be extremely powerful when played correctly. And that's why I think it's probably the most overpowered class in the game at the moment. And I would like to see not a heavy nerf, but a slight reduction, at least in terms of Pike. Then we come on to A tier. And actually, I think a lot of stuff is going to come into A tier for me. And I think this has shifted a lot, and this is probably quite good. I think this is where we want to be getting most hero weapons too in the game, and I think we actually have quite a lot in there at the moment. First off, I think myself, Poleaxe is probably in A tier. It has a very large amount of CC, probably the most CC intensive melee class in the game at the moment. We have Bill Hook, which I'm using, which can pull enemy heroes down onto the floor. I have Pushback, which is going to cause people to be on the floor. I then either have two ultimates to choose from. Rough Justice, which is basically an animation lock, so the enemy cannot escape throughout the entire animation. Very nice against enemy ranged heroes, quite nice probably for newer players. But I think actually the better ultimate, Lock of a Strike, took me a while to get a hang of it, despite being shouted at by many of you. Evo, use Lock of a Strike, what the hell are you doing with Rough Justice? It took me a while to get there, but actually now I can see that that Lock of a Strike is definitely the better ultimate. Quite nice anti-cav, quite nice against enemy units, but also extremely effective against enemy heroes, particularly when you get behind. Causes enough CC to keep them on the floor, and also does an insane amount of damage. So yeah, really the ultimate to go for, and then obviously Vector Corbin just providing the damage there as its sort of main swinging ability. So yeah, I think it's solidly in A tier, not up with the Pike and the Maul, but a really solid all-round heavy armour class. From there, I think we move on to Short Sword. A staple hero that's been a staple hero for a long time now. Wasn't used so much when the game first launched, but particularly as we've gone on, it's just become such a staple class because of it's got so many really nice abilities. It's got a lot of knockdown with things like its ultimate, the shield throw, Ironsides, which basically makes the class invulnerable. You start hitting a short sword in good armor with Ironsides, you're going to be doing 150 damage to it. Basically unkillable, which gives it so much utility in terms of going in and clearing points, causing knockdown, knocking in enemy units down before its own unit charges in. Obviously, not that this hero list is about Territory War, but obviously a staple class in Territory War. When we did some of the Conqueror's Blade League commentating, we saw that Short Sword was a really, really popular class in those 15v15 siege matches. Absolutely essential class, and that's why it's such a solid A tier class. If anything, you could probably even nudge it up to a sort of a lower S. Really, really, really nice class at the moment. From there, I think we've got a few other options. Spear's an interesting one. I think it's sort of A, borderline B. Spear, again, is kind of one of those classes that once you get the hang of it and get quite skilled with it, I think it's in quite a good place and can be quite effective. It has suffered a bit, though, with a few nerfs more recently, and it seems that the devs don't really like Spear very much at the moment and are trying to sort of force it down the list. Or at least that's kind of what it feels like from a patch note point of view. Maybe as some Spear users, you can actually comment your thoughts on this. Do you think it's sort of seeing a few nerfs, or actually is it perhaps not that bad? I think for the moment it's going to stay in A, and I think it's slightly been overtaken by Pike in terms of the Pike just being better. And so that's kind of relegated it slightly to being lesser used, and I don't think you see it as much now in siege battles. Moving on from Spear, I think we're probably going to have to look at the Musket. It's a range class with the highest damage, and it also has a lot of utility in terms of bombs and caltraps. Obviously, it has the ability to basically knock down full stacks of enemy units and obviously enemy heroes with its bombs. It has a close range kick so it can get out. It has an escape ability so it can basically dive out of the way if it's trying to get locked down by an enemy hero. Basically means it can always escape unless it's an animation lock of Rough Justice from the Poleaxe or a dual blade going in for an animation lock as well. It has very, very high damage, and I think it just has so much utility, an effective CC in a way that it really could be used in a lot of different ways. I think, again, it's one of those classes, perhaps obviously like many of them in this game, that requires a fair amount of skill to use, in a way that perhaps something like the Poleaxe I think is quite beginner friendly, which I suppose I'm just shooting myself slightly in the foot here by saying that, but I think the Musket is a much more sort of skill intensive class, or at least it can be, to really get the most out of it. Then I think for now we'll move on to B tier, because I think a few things are going to drop in here. I think Shortbow. I think Shortbow is one that on average tends to sometimes struggle, but equally in the right hands with a good crafted Shortbow, I think you can really see it starting to go up into the A tier, because its damage is a lot dependent on the craft of the weapon and the skill of the user. And I think that's also very true for dual blades, because you get some truly terrible dual blades, particularly as a heavy armor user. You get a dual blade locked onto me and it'll perhaps really not do all that much damage. I can just call the unit over to me and the dual blade in light armor will then just go down completely. Or if they don't finish me off in their ultimate cycle, then I'll just turn around and lock up a strike them to the face. And then I will kill them because they're such a light armor user. But then you get a dual blade who's got a good crafted weapon, knows what they're doing, have got their stats quickly set up, and then even as a heavy armor, I go down in seconds. And so that's why it's a class that spreads so much across the spectrum. When you get some of the great dual blade users, they're pretty much in S tier because they can easily get 10 hero kills in a match, and they can really dominate a match in that sense. But then, on average, the bulk of the players, I think you find that on average, dual blade starts to struggle a little bit in the current sort of fairly heavy armor meta, which doesn't really favour them all that much. I think also at this tier, we could probably maybe throw in the longsword. I think it's a class that's struggled for quite a long time now. It has some real positives in terms of survivability. Obviously, it has the self-heal, which is really nice. It's a heavy armor class. It's a tanky class. It has some damage potential, but it's limited when you compare it to something like the Poleaxe or the Maul, and it doesn't have the sort of usefulness or the CC abilities of something like the short sword, so it's not all that utilitarian. But it does add survivability, and it does mean you can continue to control your unit because you're still alive, and that in itself is useful, and its self-heal does self-heal units, so that can also be pretty nice as well. You can also make use of things like a speed buff, which is really nice, so it does have a few uses there which can be quite good. I think going on from that, I think I'm going to be a bit harsh on the Glaive here, and throw it down into a C tier. I like the Glaive, played the Glaive a lot, but it was recently got pretty heavily nerfed, and I think it suffered quite a lot because of it. Now, it may still realistically be creeping into the B tier, and part of it is the fact that because it's been nerfed from where it was, I almost feel a slight dislike for it now because it's just not quite the same as it once was. For me, when I played Glaive, I really liked sticking all my stats in strength, going medium armor, putting all my stuff into blunt, really raising that blunt damage because it's scaled by percentage. So once you got that base blunt damage up, the percentage scaling, which was like 680% or something, was insane, and that meant it became a real glass cannon. And you could get some real high damage rolls when using these hero abilities like Flying Reaper. But now they've kind of removed that, they really reduced the amount of percentage scaling and just put a fixed value in, then it's really not quite the same as it once was. The damage isn't there, and for me, it starts to become a little bit of a lackluster class when you're kind of lacking what its glass cannon one-shot abilities, which for me is what kind of made it. After that, I think we're going to go in with Nodachi. I feel Nodachi's always struggled a little bit as a class. Because it's medium armor, almost fighting in a heavy armor capacity, I think it struggles and it has the potential to lose its health very, very rapidly. It does have quite a few abilities that give it an ability of CC recovery, and obviously it has the ability to steal health from other users, which is quite nice and can keep it going in some fights. But I think on average, I don't tend to fear the Nodachi when I come across it on the battlefield. It generally seems like an easy kill to me. And whilst I'm sure there are some very good Nodachi players out there who could easily beat me in my Poleaxe, on average, it just tends to not be the case, and that Nodachi tends to be struggling, at least probably for newer players. And finally, I'm going to throw Longbow down at the bottom. It has suffered quite a bit from a number of nerfs. It can still be very useful, it can still be an effective class, and it probably really should have its place in its C, but it is a class that I think probably would benefit from a little bit of a buff more recently, particularly as we have a lot of things like flamethrowers, the Cyclanian Militia, the coconut throwers and stuff like that, which can be really quite hard to get to in normal circumstances. Not having ranged players like Longbows to sort of try and pick them off and blink them off can make maps a little bit more campy and a little bit harder, so I think a slight buff to Longbow probably wouldn't go amiss. But anyway, that's my list. I think you could certainly move a few of these around. I mean, as we kind of talked about through the list, I'd bump some up, and bring others down a little bit potentially quite easily. But I think that gives me kind of a reasonably broad spectrum of how I would place things. As I say, a lot of it depends on how you play them as a player. As we say, there can be amazing longbows, certainly can be amazing dual blades and shortbow players who can really get it right up to the top of the list. But there's also a lot who don't, and that kind of brings it into the average. Whereas on average, a Maul player doesn't necessarily need to be the greatest. You get stuck in there swinging your Maul, you're going to be doing a lot of damage, particularly if you're in the face of an enemy unit that's trying to block but can't. And so that's why, on average, I think they tend to be a lot more damaging. But anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Do let me know in the comments down below. Where do you think I've gone wrong and what would you move around? Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, guys. I shall see you all on the next one.